Again, just want to thank you to Jessica and the incredible team that put this event on. It's been so insightful to be a part of all of these conversations, panels, lunchtime discussions, so thank you for this. A little bit about me before we get started. I am an urban planner who was trained at a design school. So for me, the power of design is about its ability to influence the relationship between people and their built environment. More specifically, I think a lot about whose imagination has shaped our built environment and why, and how we can expand our collective consciousness on what's possible in our built environment. So this looks like how can we make visible power that is in part derived from being invisible? How can we help people to understand not only how we got here, but make a prescription about how we should think about where here is and provide some language for that. So that's a lot of my creative work. Design school in particular taught me that this is not just a battle over who gets access to resources and cities, but it is also a battle of imagination. As writer and scholar Adrienne Maree Brown often reminds us, we are living in someone else's vision for who is deserving of these resources. And I try to use the tool of design to interrupt that, to help order our attention and make us more literate in power, so that ultimately we can get to a more nuanced understanding of how race and class in particular inform a very limited vision of our cities and how they continue to be shaped by those visions and what we can do to expand it. So that's a little bit about me. I also want to share what brought me to this work of designing civic imagination and repair, and more specifically, who. So this is me and my dad. So my dad grew up in LaGrange, North Carolina, which has roughly a population of 2,000, but he always imagined a world much bigger than the farmland that raised him. Like his dad, he joined the military as soon as he was eligible, and this was the first opportunity that he had to think about himself outside of how he had been defined by his home life and community. It was an opportunity for him to be a part of something bigger than himself. He was also seeing how Black people in other countries were being treated and what rights were afforded to them abroad versus back in the States. And he spent time on lots of different military bases. In those experiences, he had shared housing. He got to walk to see his friends in their homes. He had a lot of his benefits and health care provided for. He had access to a dining hall. For some of you all, this may just sound like where we are now, a college campus. But for my dad and many others who couldn't afford that experience, it was the first time that he was able to be in a space that sparked public imagination about how our lives could be, and more importantly, how they were supposed to be for him, and also instilled the value of being around people who were different from us. So when he returned from his time abroad, back when I was just a baby, he continued to engage in those spaces that expanded civic imagination. So he spent his weekends volunteering at a public radio station in DC that brought critical information to many communities. He also was a referee and would go to charity basketball games, volunteer his time. Every election season, he served as an election judge and also trained other folks on how to be an election judge to protect the integrity of those elections. And he would take me everywhere. So our civic field trips took us all around the Washington, D.C. area. Sometimes it was to public libraries, sometimes it was to public school gyms, sometimes it was to college cultural centers, all places that we now see under attack. If we think about book bans, DEI initiatives across college campuses, and I really believe this is part of what these spaces did for me and my dad and so many others. They trained us in imagination and empathy, which I think gets us to a place of repair. And now I find us so polarized because there's such few spaces left where we're around people or forced to be around people who are different from us and actually have to face their humanity and connect with them. So in this moment, I believe we need to be trained in both imagination and repair. And you may be wondering, whose job is that? That sounds great. But my hope for today is that I can show you all that it is the job of designers to train us in imagination and repair, and most importantly, to get to the work of addressing our systemic inequities. So I'm going to share a little bit about how I do that in my creative work and my systems change work. I'm going to talk about what's working, what's kind of working, what's not so working. And I hope this can be an invitation for you all so that we can find our role in this work and most importantly, work together toward this. So that's a little bit about me. I now want to orient you to the history of the neighborhood that we're in, because this is where my creative work is based. This is also the neighborhood that I call home, so the greater Bronzeville neighborhoods. So I was first introduced to the history of this neighborhood in my graduate school research. And my master's thesis was entitled Race, Space, and the Poetics of Planning. And at the core, this research was about how we take the things that Black people created in response to spatial inequities or structural violences. So think about redlining or dehumanizing narratives. So wanted to really think about what were those institutions that communities created in response to that. So that might look like the Ada McKinley settlement homes here in Bronzeville that helped Black people who moved from the South to Chicago as a part of the Great Migration get access to resources. That might look like cultural production, neighborhood plans, right? All these institutions that were being formed, specifically to get access to resources in the built environment. So if we take the people that created those institutions seriously as urban planners and the work that they created as the work of urban planning, I believe that it makes our analysis of the built environment sharper and our solutions become more precise. Part of this is because you're then not just dealing with people and residents who had power exerted over them from the systemic removal of resources, but you have people that have a clear spatial knowledge born from navigating the intersection of multiple oppressions. You have clear strategies of power sharing and institution building that I argue urban planning serve as urban planning institutions that allocate resources, that organize systems like the Black Panther Party. And I believe that is work that urban planners can learn from. So I began this research by putting a lot of Black geographers and Black feminists like Catherine McKittrick and Bell Hooks in conversation with spatial production theorists like Henry Lefebvre. Next, I identified which are the things, like what types of institutions that I want to lift up and which Black people did I want to engage in this research. So of those things, and thinking about all the incredible institutions that were built in the absence of public institutions like planning departments, I wanted to look at art and expressions of culture, so creative interventions. And in my research, I developed a term called the poetics of planning, which refers to a spatial language rooted in cultural expression. And the folks that I wanted to center in that research were Black women artists. I was seeing all the creative maps, material, imaginative ways of knowing and being, and I thought we could learn a lot from how they specifically filled these gaps that were left by many of our public institutions. So one of my goals for this research was to create a vocabulary for the discussion and exploration of Black women's creative approaches to building and designing planning spaces in Chicago, and offer a model of reading and analyzing what I referred to as their space-making practices as legitimate and legible urban planning strategies that we built environment practitioners could learn from and ultimately sharpen our analysis, as so much of our spaces have been informed by race and class and these types of cultural production. So I can share later 100 pages of my argument on that research and what I found, but I want to focus on one of the challenges in particular in this work, which I'm sure many of you all have faced, which is the archive. So after I defended my graduate school thesis, moved to Chicago, I wanted to continue to explore the archive and its impact on planning practices in Bronzeville. So as part of that continuation project, I engaged in another lit review for this project, and I worked a lot with the work of cultural historian and writer Saidiya Hartman, particularly her work around critical fabulation. So this image is one of the more popular images that I came across when looking at the archive of Bronzeville, and I want to talk a little bit about how she helps give me an analysis to better read an image like this. So critical fabulation, which is what she's most known for, is the use of storytelling and speculative narrative as a means of redressing how history has omitted so many different experiences, particularly for those lives of enslaved people. So a lot of her research looks at the Middle Passage and using artifacts and pieces of folks' history to tell a more full story to engage in the archive. She also had a work that I used a lot, which was Wayward Lives and Beautiful Experiments, the intimate histories of riotous Black girls, troublesome women, and queer radicals. And a big part of that work was to fill in the blanks that were left in a lot of our historical records and to acknowledge people's agency, and particularly how young Black girls contributed to shaping a lot of the cultural movements, which I believe and kind of started my argument that have transformed a lot of our urban landscapes. So she specifically focused on melding history and literary imagination in Philadelphia and New York in the beginning of the 20th century. But I wanted to focus my work again on Bronzeville and telling a more full story. So I wanted to this image was often lifted up as the renaissance of this neighborhood. And I wanted to think more about all the different cultural renaissance that were happening both historically and currently in the neighborhood, how that was shaping our cultural movements and ultimately our urban landscapes. So I wanted to plan for a future of this neighborhood that better reflected a lot of the radical aspirations and desires of folks that didn't appear in the archive as much as you see the folks that do appear in the archive and those who consistently show up at town hall meetings as an example. So my research question was, how do we remember a past that does not forget anyone to build a future that includes everyone? So I went 100 years into the past and 100 years into the future. I started this project in 2020, 2019. And a big part of that is that I wanted to remember the multiple histories that existed in the past to be able to imagine multiple possibilities that can exist in the future. So again, given this limited archive, Bronzeville is always approaching in or falling out of Renaissance. That's pretty much the only axis in which this neighborhood exists in a lot of the archive, but also in our memories and in our plans for this neighborhood. And it really reconstructs in our memory who lived here, why. So you see a lot of images like this, middle class, heteronormative, married couple, kid, and really shapes what histories we preserve and who we're planning for if we think about preserving the Black middle class of this neighborhood. So I revisited this image with all the literature review that I had done, and literally zoomed out and brought in both history and speculative narrative to think about who trimmed these hedges, who was washing the car, who was tailoring the suits, who was sewing the dresses, who was hanging out, there's a public housing behind this, who was hanging out in the alleyways there, and tried to think about all the other histories and cultural renaissance that were happening during that time as a part of this work. The next part of this is thinking about what a living atlas could be that captures all of those stories. So I created the MapLibs project, which is a living atlas of the spaces that make us remember, feel, and imagine community in the greater Bronzeville neighborhoods. And I spoke with pastors, neighbors, business owners, students, teachers, lots of different folks in this. And this is what I would ask them to do. Again, this project kicked off beginning of 2020. So I was trying to find a way to engage people through what I experienced as the most disarming way to know a stranger, which is play. So I developed this word game and asked folks to fill in the blank about what their sensory experiences of community as a more accessible way to start to plan for our future. So these were examples from some of the workshops that I did at Bronzeville Scholastic Institute as a part of an After School Matters program. So I would ask students to fill out the word game and then have them list out their favorite things and least favorite things about the neighborhood, and then ask them to envision their response in the last sentence. So when it says, in the future, I hope that every street corner has, I said, okay, let's actually design that in a way that reflects all the things that invoke community for you. So we then took those elements of how could we address the things that they don't like by lifting up the things that weren't kind of a typical technical planning strategy, but that actually invoked a sense of community for them. And so we were able to have all these different types of conversations about community, safety, history, particularly where young people feel safe in this neighborhood. So that was kind of the analog version of this project. I then moved into creating a digital archive, and the concept here was, as I'm hearing these stories, I'm literally transported to people's imaginations, their memories, and I wanted to put that in a digital archive where you could physically be placed into someone's view of community. So I'll show you what that looks like. So on this archive, I collected the submissions, and if you hover over where whose submission this is, you can see their answers to the prompt. This person named that they wish more people knew about the history of the man that Mandrake Park was named after. And so I wanted to then lift up where that person was referring to and why that particular park was so important. So to be able to eventually submit this video or sound footage of what that particular memory is for them. And so I added this kind of window swipe here to literally kind of as if you're opening a window into someone else's experience. So for this person, they talked about their neighborhood feels like a community when they go to Sip and Savor and hear people conversing over tea and coffee. So you can imagine if you're going to Sip and Savor and you're literally just capturing the audio of that, could you put this in this digital archive to capture what that experience is like? And so it continues to kind of, again, lift up different images. This person talked about Uncle Jay's barbecue, so you can literally see and hear what that person was experiencing as a part of the smells that invoke community for them. So as I mentioned, I was doing a lot of different workshops and gatherings. Sometimes I hosted them, but the most exciting workshops were when I was invited into someone else's space and asked to be a part of the conversation. So early 2021, I was invited to a community town hall in Bronzeville that focused on the spike in carjackings. I don't know if you all remember, this was a really big issue that was happening. So a meeting was called to think through what that looked like. And so I started to capture what I refer to as spatial imaginaries, which are all in the forms of questions like this. So these are particular moments in the workshop where I feel like we were able to spark not just a solution, but create an invitation for what we could do to address that community challenge. So the context of this spatial imaginary is that a group of elders named that they would like to see more police presence in the neighborhood to address the spike in carjackings. The young people on the call named that they feel less safe when police are present in the neighborhood. And so it kind of got into this back and forth about whose definition of safety is most important as we address this issue. And so I was invited them to play map libs and to try to take on a different set of language to talk about what they're actually seeking. And one of the elders lifted up that she sees so many faces in the neighborhood that she just doesn't know, that she's actually missing her ability to know who's on her block, who's in her neighborhood. And so then this kind of opened up a different conversation where safety wasn't just about everyone being her exact neighbor, but like wanting some type of connection. So instead of safety being rooted in the absence of difference, like everyone just being an elder in a townhome like her, we could talk about it was the connection and the relationship that actually enhanced her sense of safety as a part of that. And so someone else lifted up, the part of why I no longer know my neighbors is that I always go through my back door. So a lot of these homes that they were living in had detached garages, and so they literally just weren't seeing each other because they were always going out their back door. And so there's this moment where this like contentious town hall discussion that was happening virtually at the time went from, whose safety is most important and who can protect that sense of safety to what can we all do to commit to each other in this moment? Like, can we imagine ourselves actually going out of our front doors and making this connection that has nothing to do with law enforcement, that has nothing to do with some of the other solutions that were lifted up? So I tried to capture some of these questions that, for me, really shifted the tone of the meeting to get back to where people are wanting to see more community and how that relationship is actually the solution as opposed to another type of tool. Another question that I often got in these workshop spaces was, what if planning institutions were fully accountable to the harm they created? To which I always said, great question. That's what I do in my day job. So this is my transition to what I do at MPC. So as I mentioned, I was trying to capture all of these questions and think about how do I take this creative work and bring it more into the work that I do at MPC. And I first just kind of want to set some context for institutions like MPC, these types of intermediaries or community development nonprofits. I think there's something like particularly important about this iteration of spatial inequities that we're experiencing that has, I think, particular salience for those of us working within institutions or with institutions. Like, I think it's one thing if we're doing this work as an individual designer that's coming in to consult, but I think it's an entirely different set of constraints, limits, and opportunities to do this type of work within an institutional or organizational context while we're navigating this city's politics, with this state's politics, with this nation's politics. And I think it's particularly important to name because there's just so many people that are questioning our institutions, whether that's students on campus, whether that's the groups that we work with, because it feels like decisions are being made by a small group of usually corporate interests instead of the majority democratic processes that we might have been taught, because that is what's happening. And so to be able to directly engage that frustration, I think is like a new set of challenges that I think a lot about what my responsibility is as someone who works within an institution doing this type of work. And so when I started my role at MPC, it was designed to be intersectional as opposed to more issue area based roles. So you might think just strictly a housing manager, or just strictly someone who works with a particular set of tools. So while doing intersectional work as a built environment nonprofit was not new, doing it intentionally and structurally for the organization was more new. And so like many institutions that work on these sorts of built environment issues, we were paying closer attention to how we need to work in ways that reflect how we don't live single issue lives. And so needing to be more specific and intentional in how we do this. And so I knew stepping into this more intersectional role at an institution at a time when we have such low trust and faith in our institutions that I had to talk to a lot of people. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to support our partners to do the type of systems change work that I really believe in and strive for in my career without taking and creating an approach that is responsive to the particular challenges that they have. So I started talking to a lot of people about what they need to make systems change. So I started with our government partners, because that was so much of the work that we do as a policy change focused organization was working really closely with them. So, I set up a lot of meetings with different departments and lots of worksheets and asked them, what would you need to be able to make systems change? And they said, well, we have this data and we updated our missions and we're going to be really explicit now about equity and justice. This was after 2020, so everyone was like riding this high of like, yes, we're doing all these really progressive things. We have a new set of data that we're now driving our decisions and policies by. And so we'd get to the end of the meeting and I say, okay, well, what do you think organizations like ours can support you with? And they said, oh, we just need you all to implement these changes. And I would say, well, like, what would that look like? And they would always give some type of technocratic solution. They'd be like, give us an innovative data management tool, and that'll just like fix all of our equity problems. Which is important. Data is important. Those types of innovative tools are important. But what I kept hearing was like policy analysis, which is a story about who we think we are, that we are rational beings that are motivated by clear incentives. And so they were defining systems change by solely doing policy change work. So the solution was just to align the right incentives so that people could change systems with these innovative data management tools. And the issue with their response is we have a lot of data and evidence that this is not how people operate, which means this is not how systems change if our systems are just groups of people. We've seen whenever big populations, groups of people undergo significant change, like a pandemic or a uprising, or building a new institution, like a new Department of Housing that was previously a part of a Department of Planning and Development, as an example. We do this because we've been motivated by a collective story of who we want to be. And this is narrative work, this is culture work. So we're always in negotiation with who we want to be as a culture and as this motivation, but then also who we think we are as just rational beings that are making these types of decisions. So I asked a few more questions in these department tours and talking with different stakeholders, and realized that they're being motivated and driven by departmental narratives of what does it mean to do this first, what does it mean to do this the best, like all of these new current administration narratives. This was right when Mayor Lori Lightfoot stepped into office. So if y'all remember, like the lighthouse was like her symbol that she was gonna come into government and really change things. So these are all the stories, the emotions, the narratives, identity types of discussions that were driving a lot of these changes. So I said, okay, I'm hearing this. And so they're like, my job title is to do this. And then they're like, well, at 9 a.m. I yell at this person. And then at 10 a.m. this person tells me this story. And then I have to make this type of thing work. So I'm like, okay, it's a little different than what's in your job description. So I said, how is this data management tool going to change the beliefs and the culture and the yelling matches and all these things that you're telling me are happening? And they said, yeah, we're just gonna like bring in some data. And so again, it was like this constant tension between the two. And they were like, oh, well, we didn't say all that. We didn't say like, we're doing these things from places of emotions or stories. So like any good accountability partner, I pulled up some receipts. So I said, well, quote number 1, this is what you all said in this meeting, which is that I'm probably too ingrained in the city to make these changes. And for me, this is like the imagination crisis, right? Like our imagination of what a different world can be is so limited because we're like deeply entangled in the very systems that we're organizing to change. And so I wanted to lift that up as like, this is going to be a hurdle in this work. So we need to engage whatever narratives you all have about what this means and what you're implying with this type of city culture. Next receipt. Someone said, while there are laws against discrimination, you truly can't legislate how people feel about one another. And I said, oh, well, you said y'all don't have feelings, but according to my receipt, you're talking about how y'all feel about each other. So this was clearly a culture that needed repair, right? This was a shift in beliefs that needed to change in order for the expression of our beliefs, like our laws, to take hold, to actually condition a culture to accept all of these new legislation that was trying to be passed at the time. Next receipt. My greatest personal challenge would be how to learn how to be subjective and objective at the same time. And I said, great, y'all have done my job, because this is the only work, right? We're like constantly balancing between the subjectivity of culture and the objectivity of what we think is like just the policy and rationality that we're trying to do. So my job was to help these folks be nimble, right? To respond to this personal challenge. And so that's the work that I tried to take on. So I took all these conversations and I said, okay, now I need a definition of systems change that reflects what you all told me you are struggling with and how we can best support. And a big part of this is that I wanted folks to understand how we cannot disentangle policy analysis from cultural analysis, and we cannot ignore the relationships that are required to do this work, specifically to do this work well. So I wanted folks to understand how we're living into these roles so that we can navigate these systems differently and enable folks to be more self-aware about how they're functioning in these systems, so that we can build a culture to allow this work to sustain and take hold and think about themselves differently. So this is the three-legged stool that my team and I developed of the incentives that need to be shifted. So these are the structural pieces, and that could include both policy and funding. We talked a lot about the processes. So, I'd ask people what they do in their job, and it would be I, and then I'd ask them, okay, how do you do that work? And they'd say, well, we. So we had to think about, okay, what are the processes, the relational pieces of this that have to shift, just not what's solely in your job description. And then this transformative work of like, what are the beliefs that we need to agree enough on to move this work forward, to not be perfectly in alignment or have everyone think exactly like us, but enough to be able to move the needle on this. So I also tried to summarize what I heard as the three biggest barriers to making systems change in this think, relate, and act buckets. So the first one was around this hyper focus on symptoms. It was every funding priority was driven by the symptoms of these systemic issues. And so getting people to take a step back and think about how do we think more at a systems level. Around relate, I heard a lot about how folks were trying to make decisions where those closest to the problem were farthest from power, and like how they were constantly hitting these barriers of things not landing how they thought they were. So really thinking about how can we respond to this relational challenge. And then the act, a lot of the systems and protocols that people were trying to introduce hadn't ever existed. And so I knew we were going to need to be creative, and they told me, well, creativity is too risky. Like I kept hearing about the kind of space to fail was just not an option. The stakes were too high, and so how do you actually kind of acknowledge what is manufactured urgency and think about where we can iterate and prototype some of these things. So this is the approach that my team and I developed. The first was helping folks to learn, folks had an understanding of these root causes, but how to understand their role within systems, help them to connect when they're being driven by a symptom and moving it to the root causes. So a big focus on the personal leadership development. The second was around co-creation. Like if you have some type of tension or trauma, whether that is between community groups, between institutions, institution to community, there's a new set of skills that you need to navigate that. So how can we equip folks with the skills needed to build the right relationships to move this work forward, and ultimately give folks space to practice sharing power? And then lastly, how do we get to this transformative piece of implementing these systems changing solutions with the creative approaches needed to try out new things to get new results? So all of that folded into this initiative that we call Change Lab. And what you see on the outside of this is all the different pillars of skill sets that we believe are important to be able to move through this continuum. And we do that in 3 different containers. We take learning events where folks can have kind of a one-time action that's focused on developing this awareness of what their role in systems are so that they can change. We also offer the container of communities of practice, where we're bringing not just individual practitioners of a sector, but taking groups but with different institutions. So if there's been some type of fracture between 2 institutions, that's who we bring into our communities of practice. So our client is the relationship, not the individual institution. And then lastly, the transformation part is like deep partnership to actually get under the hood of your organization, your department, your collective, and think about what does it take to implement the solutions that we've now built together on this journey. And we do that through the lens of engaging systems thinking, collaboration, and narrative and culture change. Okay, That was a lot. So I hope to leave you all thinking, oh, by the way, this is my parents, and this is me. I hope to leave you all thinking differently about the moment we are in, how we got here, where we can go together, and what gets in the way. I hope this reinforces your belief that you do have the capacity to change and that we can create more lasting policy change with this. Generations of racist policies, decision-making have shaped the built environment that we see today, but it's up to us to decide what we will do about how our environments have been shaped based on the imagination and fears of very few people, and how we have been shaped, our values, our beliefs, along with it. Where do we find the courage to take up that which has been handed to us by those like my dad, who was determined that the status quo was not sufficient? How do we transform ourselves into the fighters, like you see my mom ready to take on the battle here, of who will sustain and keep building this movement of design as activism? How do we build the transformative relationships needed to make transformative solutions? Before we decide where we can go, we all need to know where we are, who we are, where we came from, and what we care about. We all came into this world, this very young project that we know as America, with lots of different ideas and lots of inherited beliefs. But my dad and I both got to experience the power of being a part of something bigger than ourselves, to feel the connection with those who were different from us on our civic field trips, and the joy of organizing with others to achieve this something bigger. For my dad, it began with a spark on a military base that led to giving people a love of civics like he has done for me. For me, it began with a spark on one of my dad's civic field trips and led to my career in designing civic imagination and repair. Those experiences shaped not only our commitment to democracy, but also how we think change happens, who change is needed for, the acceptable methods of making that change, and what kind of change is possible. My time, my place, my material conditions significantly shaped how I see the world, how I approach building a new one as we repair, and how I've come to think about change. My parents here gave me the most enduring lessons about civic imagination, and while my dad, if he were alive today, would not be able to imagine my life and career and the opportunities that I've been able to have, he absolutely would have been able to understand my choices, like arguing to keep my local library on 35th and King open and having updated services and design features, about getting more funding for my college's Black Cultural Center, which I often had to organize around. My dad would stubbornly practice hope in the South, where he actively and subconsciously fought other people's limited imaginations of who he could be in this country. So this is my call for you all to engage more deeply with your imagination, to train others, and I hope you answer this call. You can start today by envisioning a construction of a world not yet born, where more of our systems work for more people. Seek out the connections to help you construct it. Create those connections, those possibilities. It's all creative work. So while I share your fears, your furies, your righteous anger about this world and the work ahead, I also trust your creativity, so you should too. And although this work will be messy and the possibilities on the other side will be worth it, I can't promise you that resistance like what you often see in our media, but I can tell you that everyone in this space is our greatest hope. So thank you all.
I'd love to invite some questions from the audience for Chandra.
Hang on one sec while we give you a mic.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was awesome. And something that stuck out to me was in your Mad Libs system that you created, and one of the responses from, I think it was one of the students, and they talked about like what was in their neighborhood and what they wanted to see. I saw something around like they wanted to see corner stores. So, and I think that when they say corner store is obviously like, what is a corner store? A place where you can get like resources, food or hygiene products or something like that. But how do you see your work helping people to really figure out like what is it that they really need in their community? So yeah, like how have you seen that, impact people in your work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think that's why I wanted to start with something that is so innate and instinctual, like how we sense things. And so we didn't start the conversation there. They told me about the foods that they love to smell. They told me about the sounds of the music. And I said, well, where does this happen? Where do you get these types of snacks? Where do you hear these songs? And then we started to talk about the corner stores. And then we also engaged in a conversation about what they didn't like about their neighborhood and how their corner store could be a resource to respond to those things. So I also invited them to say, while you're familiar with how this particular resource exists now, how can you design it to be responsive to these challenges? And so I think to both ground people in what their most kind of engaged and embodied sense of this work is, and then moving them to a more imaginative place of like, we actually can organize for these types of resources to look differently because someone organized and designed them to look the way that they do now, like the way our neighborhood has been shaped. Like I think that's usually the kind of decision points that I walk students through. And when there's silence, I say, well, let's look back at the word game. You already have answers about how this place should be designed. So I think engaging in the language that I hear people talk about of like, I feel safe here, these are where my homies hang out, this is what I hate about the sound of this thing in my neighborhood or the sight of this thing, starting there was important.
Thank you. That was really fun to listen to. Thank you so much. There were two things you said that really stood out to me. The phrase, a poetics of planning, like beautiful. And the most disarming way to know a stranger is play. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about not everyone thinks planning is play or particularly fun. So can you just talk to us a little bit about how you plan for play or how you sort of bring these two together, just how it makes sense to you?
Yeah, I think, well, I started with kind of the first tool that I was taught as a planner, which is surveys. Like one thing a planner is gonna do is give you a survey. And I thought back to an experience that I had in grad school where I was doing the assignment of creating a survey, going to community, and the survey was about what you'd want to see 50 years in the future. And the community member said, you haven't responded to the 50 years of the past. Like, how do you expect me to get here when there's all of this deferred maintenance of what this particular institution has done? And there was like such a contentious moment, but I think it was also an opportunity to talk about why that person decided to even come to the meeting. Because I think you have to have a sense of hope to be able to engage in planning for a future. Like if you think another day exists, you're a hopeful person. And so I think it was in those conversations when I heard about the things that inspired that person, like they were very playful. It was the park that I wanted to take my son to hasn't been repaired, so I came out to this meeting. Or I love to take my mom out to this particular restaurant because it always makes her smile when she orders this thing. Like, I think play is so present in how we naturally communicate about what keeps us going and what keeps us connected. And so it was easier for me to access that because people had invited me into those spaces. So I didn't create spaces of play. People brought me in to their memories of play when they answered those questions. And so I think that was the connection point that I made, that I'm just here to facilitate these things, but it's lifting up your visions, your definitions, and bringing them to these institutions.
My mic's stopped. Wasn't it, you had a couple of questions too, did you?
Sure. Yeah. So
you are not a native Chicagoan, and you came to Chicago. Can you share kind of what drew you here and drew you to Bronzeville, and how your experiences in other places have shaped your interest in coming here? Like, so what's special about Bronzeville?
Yeah.
Why did you come here as opposed to all of the other places you could have gone to, or places that you'd been before?
Yeah, so my introduction to Chicago is through Eric Williams, who's the owner of the Silver Room in Hyde Park. And he had a particular focus and interest around cultural economies and the roles that festivals play in building, specifically the economy of the South Side. So that was like my first research assignment that I was given. And in all of the stakeholder meetings that I had as a part of it, somehow there would be a tie back to the history of this neighborhood about either a particular cultural venue that they modeled their parties after, or a particular cultural organizer that inspired how they do their work, or really just some of the history nerds that I got to talk to, telling me about what other models of cultural economies to look at. I kept being drawn back to this place, and so that started me down deeper research and getting into the archive and thinking about how I could be supportive and lifting up that legacy as well. So I think it was really through cultural economies that I first got connected to this neighborhood and the extraordinary history that exists in the archive and outside of the archive. So that was my introduction. I think prior to coming to graduate school and then eventually here, I was working in Nairobi, Kenya, which is a completely different context as a climate change planner at UN Habitat. And I think when I thought about kind of the macro problems that places like the UN are working on, it's very reactive. People only call the UN when there's a literal disaster. I think thinking about ways that I could be more proactive and lifting up the cultural resilience of communities was something that I wanted to do more of, to be a steward of, to feel accountable to, like enhance and contribute to. So I think that was a big part of what felt different about the work that I could do here, as opposed to the role that I played before, or just thinking about other cities that I worked in hadn't felt nearly as connected as I did or embraced by the cultural organizers and artists that I met here.
Other questions? I have more, but I'll open it up to anyone. Sarah.
Thank you so much. You are so amazing. I wanted to hear about where the sidewalk grows. Could you tell us a little bit about that project?
Yeah, I promise this wasn't a plant. Thank you, Sarah. I'm a big fan of Sarah. So Where the Sidewalk Grows was a part of an artist fellowship that I had through an organization called Three Walls. And we were thinking a lot about, I was doing all this research, I was engaging in all these community meetings. How did I want to show what I had learned and really honor the work that I had been able to be a part of? And so some of my peers were doing more typical, traditional exhibits or gallery displays, and that just didn't feel aligned with how vulnerable folks had been with me and how inviting folks had been around their experiences of this community. So I kept coming back to what would be a medium that was accessible. And after having written 100 pages of research, I found it way harder to write a short story about this work, but it felt important to me that it felt like an invitation, and I recognize 100 pages of research doesn't feel so inviting. So I wanted to think about what's the right pacing of the story, what's the right medium. And some of the workshops I did were at senior housing buildings, and a lot of the stories I heard from elders were about things that they had personally archived in their photo albums. So I kept coming back to like a photo album felt like the right pacing, of a story. I wanted someone to pick this up and it feel like a photo album, which is something you can flip through in 5 minutes if you want, or 3 hours like I do with my family when we're reminiscing and lifting up stories. So that's the experience that I wanted to call back to as a part of this. And I also thought about the mediums that the students were most excited about, which is when I would bring graphic history novels to give them as readings or activities that I would do in the class. And so I wanted a resource that felt as much accessible for an elder as it did for a young person. And so I landed on this graphic novel that was the length of a photo album, but the medium that young people wanted to see. And in the story, it's a composite story of a lot of different people that I met along this creative journey, and kind of spliced together some of the moments and kind of dialogues that were a part of that work, and tried to tell a coherent story through the eyes of Amani, who's a 13-year-old girl who's going through a MapLibs workshop like how I would have done, but facilitated by her teacher. And she's having conversations with her teacher, her peers, her grandmother about who and what used to exist within the neighborhood, and kind of collecting all these experiences from her peers. So one of the things I always do in my workshops is I give homework that you have to do the MapLibs with someone of a different generation. So most of my folks were Gen Z, Gen Alpha, and so having them do the assignment with someone of a different generation. And so those were the stories that I was often kind of getting back from people, and so I wanted to map out a story that felt like a similar trajectory and learning journey that I tried to best facilitate in the class.
Take one final question.
I have a two-part question. One, where can people find the book, and do you have any copies on you for purchase?
Thank you. Also not a planned question. You can find it on all mediums that you get your books at, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble, the large distributor that we all know as well. I have a handful of copies with me, and see me after if you would like one.
Great, awesome. I'll see you after. My other overarching question is, you've talked a lot about the amazing work and change work that you've done in policy, and at the hyper-local level, working with community members, but then also trying to actually change policy, change laws. And I know that work is hard because you mentioned that even when you go to meetings, they're like, well, what about the problems from 50 years ago or the problems that I'm facing today? I can't even imagine a future, right? How do you stay kind of hopeful and not jaded when you're kind of interacting and butting against these systems that are so hard to change? I'm sure there's a lot of students here, people here who kind of need to understand, like, how do we continue to stay vigilant even when it's hard and challenging? So would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I shared a little bit about this. I think planning is inherently hopeful to be able to think about a future, but for me, I mean, I keep going back to the stories I shared about these very playful moments that I had with young people. I think that was a real source of hope when I was writing something where I was like, I just want to write 100 pages. It's much easier than writing 20. So that was something that motivated me. But I think just generally to do this work, I would interact with these students who would make mistakes, who would maybe mess up in an assignment that I gave them. The world wouldn't end, I think I constantly got to watch people make mistakes and grow and learn, and that's a luxury I don't get to see with a lot of adults. It often feels so much more high stakes, so I think to know that that type of commitment to learning is possible really inspires and motivates me to double down on my commitment to learning, to be sharpened, to be softened by the people that I'm engaging with, and to not let the hard work of policy harden me. I've done a lot of work to not absorb the energy of some of the partners that I work with, because as a facilitator, I'm trying to build a space where that type of learning journey that I see with 13-year-olds can be possible with Gen X and other generations that I engage with. And so I think to continue to make a soft container for folks to land in, to make mistakes in, to iterate on, to fail quickly, and know that we have a space that will continue to support them, like that moment, and also seeing people develop and engage their curiosity in the workshops that I facilitate or the creative spaces that I try to build for folks always fills me up and allows me to keep going.
All right, please join me in thanking Chandra for joining us today. Jessica?
That's it.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Please do stick around. There's some snacks and things if you like. We will be following up, as I said, with proceedings and trying to capture all the things that you couldn't go to. I'm so happy that it looked like people were making connections, and we will be in touch. So thank you very much. Thank you, Chandra, for sharing your time.